So remember, we're talking about vehicle financing. And in the first lesson, we basically talked about how housing about. Okay. So in the first lesson, we talked about purchasing a vehicle. Purchasing it outright with cash, which is pretty uncommon, especially for sort of the average vehicle driver. And in this one, we're going to talk about leasing a vehicle and how it sort of compares to purchasing. And like I said before, when I briefly talked about leasing, it's like renting a vehicle. So what you do is you go to a dealership and you say, you pick out this car, and it's a new car. And you got to decide, okay, do I want to purchase it outright or do I want to lease it? Okay. Purchasing it outright means put down a down payment if you have one, do a trade-in if you have one. Once all that's taken away, finance the rest, get your cost per month, and then start paying that until the vehicle is paid off. Okay? Or you can decide to lease a vehicle. If you lease a vehicle, generally the monthly payments are less, okay, than purchasing outright. In addition, you don't really have to put down much of a down payment for a lease. Now, those are advantages, except the big disadvantage of leasing is you only lease for a certain period of time, say 3 years. At the end of 3 years, that vehicle is still not yours because you rented it. Whereas if you purchased it outright and say you did it over 5 years, at the end of 5 years, that vehicle is yours to do whatever you want with. Okay? So with leasing, you lease for a certain period of time, and at the end of that time, you have a decision to make. You've paid off a portion of the vehicle. There's still a cost of the vehicle still left to be paid. You can either buy the car after your lease is done, or you can turn the keys in and say, no, I'm done. And which one to do sort of depends on what you've done with the vehicle or what you plan to do with the vehicle. Okay? So it says here in the second paragraph, you have to consider many factors before making a decision. So, for example, some people want to drive a new car every few years. They want a new vehicle. So leasing might be a good option. But if you intend to keep your vehicle for a longer period of time, then purchasing or financing might be a good option. Depending on how much you drive per year. Because when you lease a vehicle, they limit the kilometers you can drive per year. So, like if you're traveling all over Canada and the US and you're leasing a vehicle, chances are you're going to drive more kilometers per year than what the lease allows you. So if you go over, you have to pay for every additional kilometer you go over. That's an extra cost to you, and that can get expensive. Okay? So you can see there's a lot of factors sort of to consider leasing versus purchasing. Okay? So the conditions of a lease. And like I said, remember, generally down payment for a lease is little to nothing. Monthly payments are lower. But you don't own the vehicle after a certain period of time. So like I said, conditions of a lease, okay, different dealerships offer different leases that have different conditions. It all depends on the number of years you're going to lease it for, costs of extra kilometers driven. I think it's something like, I leased a vehicle one time and I think I was allowed 12,000 kilometers a year. Anything over that, I had to pay extra per kilometer. Okay. So you'll be responsible for that. You would be responsible if there was excessive wear and tear on the vehicle when you turned it in after the lease. Like, it should be in a certain condition, but if you've driven it into the ground, then chances are you're going to be paying something. Or there's a penalty if you end your lease early. And then, like I said, at the end of the lease, you can return the vehicle or you can purchase the vehicle at what it's called, it's guaranteed residual value. Residual value means the value of the vehicle after the lease. So let's say you buy a vehicle for $28,000. You pay a certain amount over 3 years per month. And at the end of 3-year lease, the vehicle is still valued. The residual value is, say, $15,000. You haven't paid the whole thing, you paid a portion. So you can decide to say that, okay, I want to buy the vehicle, and then you got to pay the $15,000, either with cash or through borrowing. Or you can say, no, I'm just going to give you my vehicle. They're going to check to make sure you haven't done this, excessive wear and tear. They're going to make sure you haven't driven extra kilometers. And if you've met all that, then you're good. They'll just take the keys and you're done. And then you can decide what you want to do with your next vehicle. So some factors you should consider when trying to decide whether it's not, or whether it's best to lease. Okay. Repair costs. That's something that a lease could have an advantage, because with new vehicles come warranties, and warranties usually last a few years. So if you lease a few years, most of your vehicle is going to be covered under warranty if something happens. By the time the warranty expires, your lease has expired. So usually major costs don't start appearing on a vehicle until, like, after a few years. I mean, generally you think the first 3-4 years that you drive the vehicle, you're going to have to pay for maintenance, but you're not going to have to pay, like, I mean, if you have to pay for a new engine, something's wrong. Okay? Because an engine goes out on a vehicle within 3 years of it being new. That's not good. And again, I said how much you drive. If you drive a lot, leasing is probably not a good option. And the monthly payments, if you want to save money now, maybe leasing's better. If you're not worried too much about money and you want to pay a little bit more because you want to own the vehicle, go ahead and purchase it. Okay. And again, we talked about changing vehicles. Like I said, I had an uncle. He wanted a new Audi every 3 years. And that was it. So he leased. He leased that Audi, brand new Audi, drove it for 3 years, turned the keys in, leased a new one. And he did that for years and years and years. And he was perfectly happy, because it didn't bother him that he didn't own a vehicle. He was just happy he was driving a newish vehicle the whole time. And he was probably happy he was driving an Audi too. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to sort of do some calculations over the rest of this lesson, where we're going to compare leasing and then buying the vehicle after the lease. Then leasing and buying the vehicle with cash. Leasing and then buying the vehicle with borrowing. Or buying and just starting with borrowing. And we're going to see how they compare. Okay? So a minivan, this is what we're going to do. We're going to focus on a minivan. It sells for $28,500 plus tax. It can be leased for 24 months at $479 per month, plus taxes on the monthly payment. A down payment of $32.75 is required. the guaranteed residual value of the vehicle is 65% of this price after the 24 months. Okay? So to calculate the total monthly leasing payment, well, how much does the person pay per month? And how many months? 24. So that's going to give us, oh, sorry. I jumped ahead of myself here. We're not going to do the total yet. We're going to do the taxes first. $479 a month. What do I multiply by to include the taxes? Do you remember? Do you remember the number if we want to include GST and PST? It was a special number, 1 point. Well, how much is GST? 7. How much is, sorry, PST is 7. GST is 5. So together makes 12. This is how we find the total including tax. Multiplied by 1.12. So whenever you want to add the tax onto something, take the value of whatever it is times 1.12 in Manitoba. So we get $536.48. That's how much this person is going to pay per month under the leasing agreement for 2 years. Now, the total paid by the end of the lease. Well, they're paying $536.48. That includes taxes for 24 months. So the total cost. Oh, and we paid, don't forget the down payment, which I almost forgot. Plus the down payment, because that's having to be paid as well, $16,150.52. So that's how much they put in for a down payment for this vehicle and to lease it for 2 years. Taxes included. Now, at the end of 2 years, we got to figure out what's the value of the vehicle, including tax. Well, remember, what was the value of the vehicle? What was the value of the vehicle without tax at the beginning? $28,500. How do I find 65% of this? So that means without taxes, this is how much is still left to pay. But remember, if they're starting sort of a new agreement now. So because they're starting a new agreement, they're going to get taxed on this. So I've got to do 18,525 times 1.12. And that gives us 20,748. So if they decide, he or she, they've leased it for 2 years, they've paid this much. They have to pay this if they want to buy it outright. Okay? So to find how much they paid already and how much if they pay cash for the rest of it, add them. And that works out to $36,898.52. Now this is This is our one thing we're going to compare. And we're going to compare on the second last page. So all I'm going to do is I'm going to jump here to the second last page. We've just calculated this. Leasing for 2 years and then purchasing outright. Okay, so remember that value was, and this was from example 1D, yeah, 1D, $36,898.52. Okay, now what happens? The second one, we leased it, or we paid a lease for 2 years. But we want to take a loan on the rest. Okay. So keep in mind, we've already paid $16,152. The amount that we have to pay still is $20,748, including tax. And I want to borrow that. So we have to calculate the monthly payment on the residual value. So remember, what was the vehicle worth at the end of the lease? It was $20,748. That's how much of a loan I have to take, assuming that you're not putting another down payment. So now we got to go to the table to help us calculate what the monthly payment is going to be. So if you go to the amortization table, the deal that this person got, 3 years at 6%. So 3 years at 6%, $30.42 for every $1,000 of loan. Okay, so from the table, 3 years at 6% represents $30.42 per $1,000 that you borrow. Well, we are borrowing 20,748 of these. Sorry, we are borrowing 20,748. So how many thousands are in this? Well, how many thousands are in 2748 divided by 1,000? And then multiply that by how much it costs per 1,000. To get $631.15. So you can see that that's a higher payment than when we were leasing. Calculate the total of the monthly payments. Well, we're doing it for 3 years. That's $631.15 per month. So 3 years is 36 months. So 631.15 times 36 is 22,721.40. So now we're ready to calculate the total amount of leasing and borrowing to buy the rest. Remember, the lease we calculated a long time ago was 16,150.52. That's how much the first 2 years cost us. We decided to finance the rest. And when we financed the rest and paid it for 3 years, we paid this amount. So the total that we paid if we leased and then borrowed is $38,871.92. So remember, this is leased and then borrowed to pay off the rest. And how many years did it take us to do that? How long was the lease? Yeah, so it was 2 years for the lease, 3 years to borrow the rest of the money. So that was paid off after 5 years. Okay. So this is another major amount we want to put on that second last page. 38,871.92. And that was from example 2C. Clearly, it's going to be more than if you leased and then bought, paid with cash, right? Because here, you're not paying any borrowing costs. You're not paying any interest because you're buying it outright. Here, because you're borrowing, you're going to have to pay some interest, so it's going to be a little bit more, which clearly it is. Okay. Now, these two we've already done from lesson 4.1. So purchasing outright. This is kind of just a review from lesson 4.1. So calculate the total purchase price of the new minivan. Remember, it was $28,500 plus DST and GST. How do I calculate that? $28,500 times 1.12. So if I have the cash lying around, and I don't, it's not going to cost me, or it's not going to take me any time to pay for it. I'm going to pay for it immediately. I pay $31,920. So here, if I purchase it outright, I just pay the tax. Clearly, that's going to be the cheapest. But it's also going to be one of the toughest because who has that lying around? Be nice, I suppose. If I had that lying around, I'd probably use it for my mortgage. Okay, and then finally, and this again is reviewed from lesson 4.1, what about if we borrow? So we've done that page. There we go. Right at the top. So we're going to purchase and we're going to do a 5-year loan at 6%. And so the reason we're going to do a 5-year loan is so we can compare it to leasing and buying. Because remember when we leased it for 2 and then borrowed it for 3? This is what we're going to see. What if we actually just did the purchasing for 5? So we want to calculate the monthly finance payments. So we've got the amount of the loan we've got to get. And remember the cost with tax for the minivan was $31,920. And notice here we can put a down payment of $4,000. So I take away that $4,000. because I don't have to worry about borrowing that. And I get 27,920. That's the amount I have to borrow. Okay. So from the table, we got to figure out how much we're going to pay for every 1,000. And it's 5 years at 6%, which works out to 5 years at 6%, $19.33 for every 1,000. It does. Well, I got to figure out how many thousands my loan is. So 27,920 divide 1,000 times the cost per 1,000 will give me my monthly finance payments. $539.60. Okay. And finally, remember, deferred means your loan payments plus your down payments. What a deferred payment means, how much you're going to pay in total by taking the loan and paying interest and whatever you put down. So the loan payment, while we're paying it for 5 years, which is 60 months, so the deferred, well, first of all, for the loan, $539.69 per month for 60 months, plus the down payment, because that was a cost I had to pay. It's going to get the total amount I have to pay for the down payment, the loan, and the interest. And that works out to $36,381.40, which is this one, purchasing through financing. So that's example 4C. So you see all the options we have. So notice that if we leased and bought it outright, or if we borrowed for 5 years, these are pretty close, about $500 difference. Okay? The biggest expense is leasing for a few years and then borrowing for a few years, which is kind of common sense. Okay? So you can see that leasing and then purchasing through borrowing at the end is going to cost more than if you just started purchasing from year one, right? It's going to cost you a couple thousand less over 5 years. And the advantage of this is after 5 years, the vehicle's yours. Okay, after 5 years, the vehicle's yours. And so that's that's a bit of a wash. But what was I going to say? No, you own it at the end of it, either one of these ones. What was I going to say? I can't remember what I was going to say. Oh, I know what I was going to say. So if you lease it for a couple of years and then turn it in and get a new one to lease,
you can see that that will cost you less, but you'll never own a vehicle. You'll never own it out.
So just to sort of summarize, like it says here, there's a lot of things that you have to consider between the two. Okay. So, like I said, a lot of times it depends. What do you want to do with the vehicle? What are your personal preferences? And what's your financial situation? Okay. I mean, to be honest, I leased a vehicle early on in my career because I wanted less monthly payments that I could use for rent. Right. So it wasn't, I mean, I didn't want to lease, but it saved me a little money in the short run. It wouldn't save me money in the long run, but it saved me a little money in the short run. Okay.